In dialectical behavior therapy, there are a number of different emotion regulation skills, so how do we know which one to apply? In this video, we're going to look at an emotion regulation flowchart that helps us figure out what skills to use to change our unwanted emotions. So we start by identifying the emotion we'd like to change or influence, and then we ask ourselves, does this emotion fit the facts? An emotion fits the facts if it's an appropriate emotion for the situation we find ourselves in, and if its intensity and duration are in line with what's reasonable for the situation. And there's a whole worksheet we can use to evaluate whether an emotion fits the facts that you can learn about in my Check the Facts video, and you'll find all of the videos I mention here organized together on my site selfhelptunes.com, where you can download a copy of the emotion regulation flowchart. So if our emotion fits the facts, we go down this path. And if it doesn't fit the facts, then we go down the other path. And either way, the next question we ask ourselves is acting on this emotion effective or helpful to me? So what do we mean by this? Every emotion has an action urge, some action or behavior the emotion makes us feel like doing. So for fear or anxiety, the urge is to run away and avoid. For anger, the urge is to attack. For sadness, the urge is to withdraw or isolate ourselves, and so on. And acting on this urge would be acting based on what we call emotion mind. It's our emotions that are driving our action. But before we act on this urge, we ask our wise mind if expressing or acting on this emotion is effective in this situation. Now, wise mind is a bit of a tricky concept. In DBT, there are 3 states of mind we can operate out of. In emotion mind, our emotions control how we think and act, without taking reason and logic into account. In reasonable mind, we think and act reasonably and rationally, without taking our emotions into account. In wise mind, we think and act reasonably and rationally, while also taking into consideration our emotions and how we feel. Wise mind is important when making decisions because it helps us access our intuition and inner wisdom. And for a more detailed description of wise mind, emotion mind, and reasonable mind, I have a video about this you can check out. But sometimes wise mind can be difficult to access, in which case we can try using a pros and cons list to help us determine whether or not acting on this emotion would be effective. So if we're feeling angry and have the urge to lash out, we can ask ourselves, what are the pros of acting on this emotion? And what are the cons of acting on this emotion? And then, what are the pros of not acting on this emotion? And what are the cons of not acting on this emotion? So if we're having trouble accessing wise mind, sometimes a pros and cons list can help us figure out whether or not to act on an emotion. So now there are a few different options depending on our answer to the question, is acting on this emotion effective? In DBT, there are 3 main strategies we use to help change unwanted emotions. The first is checking the facts, which involves looking at our thoughts and interpretations of a situation or event to see how accurate they are. And if they're not accurate, we modify these thoughts and interpretations to make them fit the facts better. And when we do this, since our thoughts have such a big influence on how we feel, changing our thoughts results in changes in our emotions as well. The second way we can change our emotions is through opposite action. When acting on an emotion-action urge is not effective, we can regulate our emotion by using opposite action. Since our actions and emotions are so closely connected, when we act opposite to an emotion-action urge, we start to change that emotion. And I have a whole video that explains how to use opposite action in more detail. And if our thoughts are already accurate, so there's no benefit in trying to change them, and acting on our emotion urge is effective, so we don't need to use opposite action, then we can engage in problem solving, which means going back to the situation or event that's triggered the emotion and seeing if we can't come up with a plan to change that situation so that it doesn't provoke such a strong emotional reaction. So now let's plug these options into the flowchart. So if we've determined that acting on our emotion is effective, then the next step is to be mindful of our current emotion. and I talk about how to do this in my video on emotion regulation and acceptance. So when we become mindful of our emotion and accept how we're feeling, it usually helps regulate the emotion, and we'll notice a decrease in how intense that emotion feels. And then the next step is to act on that emotion. And if our emotions do fit the facts, then the next step is problem solving. And even if our emotions don't fit the facts, if acting on our emotion is effective, we can still act on our emotion action urge. Or we could consider using opposite action instead, or we can come up with a sort of compromise between acting on the emotion and using opposite action, and we'll look at an example of this coming up. And if we've determined that acting on our emotion is not effective, then the next step is to not act on that emotion. And if our emotion fits the facts, instead of acting on our emotion urge, we take opposite action. And once we use opposite action, we can try problem solving to see if we can improve the situation that provoked the emotion in the first place. And if acting on our emotion urge is not effective and our emotions don't fit the facts, then we use the Check the Facts worksheet to change our thoughts and make them fit the facts better. And once we've changed our thoughts to make them fit the facts better, we can then use opposite action. So let's look at some examples. Let's say we're sad because we've had a tough week at work and we feel stuck in a job we don't like. And we find this emotion does fit the facts. And based on this emotion, our urge to act is to call a friend and go out for coffee and vent. And we find that this action urge is an effective way to manage sadness, so we act on it. And since our behavior influences our emotions, we probably feel better afterwards. Or let's say we have an exam coming up, and we're really anxious and worried that we're going to fail. And we find this emotion does fit the facts. But if our action urge is to avoid even thinking about the exam because it makes us so anxious, well, ignoring the exam coming up is not effective, so we don't act on this urge. Instead, we take opposite action. We don't avoid what's making us anxious, and instead we spend some time studying. And again, since our behavior influences our emotions, we'll probably feel less anxious once we start to study. Now, in both of these scenarios, since our emotions fit the facts, we can use problem solving to try to figure out a way to change the situation that's prompting our emotion. For example, figuring out a way to get a different job, or coming up with a plan to prepare for the exam that doesn't leave us so anxious. Now let's say we've ordered some takeout, and it gets here really late, and it's already cold, and part of the order is missing, and we're just furious about this. And we check the facts, and we find our emotion does not fit the facts. Being a little mad would be appropriate, but we're not just a little mad, we're enraged. Now, if our action urge is to call the restaurant and complain, even though our emotion doesn't fit the facts, this action is effective, so we do it. But maybe we're feeling so angry right now, we're liable to start yelling on the phone, which could still be effective, but we could also consider opposite action as well. And opposite action for anger involves taking a time out, calming ourselves a bit, and then being nice to other people instead of attacking them. So here's the combination situation I was talking about earlier, where we act on an emotion urge while also using opposite action. So we still act on the urge to complain and let the other person know we're upset, but we do it in a manner that's not going to alienate people by yelling or screaming at them. And we can use our interpersonal objectives effectiveness skills to help us do this assertively and get what we want from the interaction. Or let's go back to a situation where we have a test coming up and we're panicking about it and afraid we're going to fail. But this time we find the emotion doesn't fit the facts. We've been studying for weeks and we know the material inside out, but our emotion action urge is telling us to stay up all night studying. And we realize this is not effective. It's just going to make us tired tomorrow and make it harder to focus when we write the test. So since acting on our emotion is not effective, instead, we want to change our thoughts about the situation to make them fit the facts better. So we use the Check the Facts worksheet. And when we change our thoughts, realize how well prepared we are and that there's no chance that we're going to fail. Since our thoughts have such a big influence on how we feel, our emotions will change as well, and will no longer be as anxious. And then we can use opposite action. Instead of staying up all night, studying and panicking, we can do something to relax, take our minds off the test, and then go to bed at the usual time and get a good night's sleep. And when we take this opposite action, our anxiety will decrease even further. So that's how we decide which emotion regulation skills to use in order to change our unwanted emotions. And you can download this emotion regulation flowchart from my site, selfhelptunes.com, where you'll also find all of my DBT videos. And my video on problem solving and action plans will be out soon. So please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss that or any of my other videos when they come out.